talk about agriculture, and I don't really think you can really understand the New Testament without really understanding how these people lived in the Old Testament. And a lot of Jesus' parables or Yeshua's parables are based on agricultural traditions in those times. So, that's one of the reasons why I think this is so important, that we really have a good understanding in the agricultural things. And I know Pastor Nick, too, some of the things I explained to him. Well, you know why they did that, Pastor Nick? He said, no, why? And I said, well, that's the way they farmed back in those days. So that's one of the things. And, before I get started, we'll take the first slide. I want to kind of go a little bit about myself. I know a lot of you don't know all about me or how I really got into agriculture and so forth. So, my first slide is, who am I? Well, actually, I'm one of the people that when Pastor asked who was born in Florida, I was an original Floridian. And I was born in Orlando in the early 50s, and I call it the PD time, pre-Disney. Before it was taken over, it was a very small agricultural type of community around there. So I was born in that, and then actually we moved into the Tampa, Seffner area in about 1958. And like Mary, I grew up on a farm in Seffner, a citrus grove, about 15 acres, and we had a 2-story frame house. So I could relate very much to her visualization of what this property looked like in those days. So my father was in the agricultural business, and that's where I got a little bit. But we grew up on this farm in 1958. We moved there, and so as I grew older, and my dad traveled a lot with the job, and he was gone mostly 3 weeks out of the a month, but he was home on the weekends, and so he was kind of what you would call a part-time hobbyist farmer, what you would say nowadays. But I grew up in that environment, and actually when I was about 11 years old, he put me on the tractor and taught me how to drive the tractor with the disc and everything. So I became the de facto caretaker for the farm during the summers and after school. So, I really hadn't determined that that's what I wanted to do in agriculture, but we kind of went that. 1970, graduated from Brandon High School, and I went on to USF. And USF didn't have a degree in agriculture, and I really didn't know what I wanted to do, but I ended up getting a degree in botany in 4 years later. So the study of plants, which, what are you going to do with that? But right in the middle of that, I guess that was 68, my draft number came up, and I was number 50. And I was not really excited about that. Vietnam War was in the full swing right then. And, I want to bring up to a lot of you young people in here, your parents and really have good wisdom. They have a lot of knowledge, and of course, when we were young, you're really not thinking so much, because I was really, after my draft number came up, I wanted to drop out of school and join the Army and get this thing over with. So, but my parents, especially my father, said, no, finish your college degree. You'll have a much better chance in the services. If you've got a degree, you could go to officer school and so forth. So I said, okay. So I went ahead that, and then I graduated. Of course, the Vietnam War is still going on. And then my father comes to me and says, son, without an advanced degree, you're just going nowhere in the corporate world. So, so he said, okay. So I went to Gainesville from then and got a degree in vegetable production. So I became a expert in vegetables with a master's degree. And by that time, the war had ended, and so I was pretty good. And so, my first job, I came back to Hillsborough County and was the extension service agent for vegetables in this, and I got a whopping $12,000 a year salary on that. And so that was 1975. And, looking back on this, and my father was kind of pushing me to get a PhD, to go on for 2 more years of college. And I said, man, Dad, I am tired of living in poverty. I'm tired of not having anything. I'm driving a crummy car. I want something good. I want the good life. And so I didn't do that, and that's been one of my regrets all the way through that. And but anyway, so I did that, and then, as my career kind of went on going through this, after I worked 5 years for the Hillsborough County doing vegetable production. I did a lot of the gardening programs and stuff, setting people up to do gardening and so forth, and that's what you did. And then came an opportunity to work in the real world in a commercial and not work for the government, to work in commercial agriculture. And it was with a phosphate company, and it was Gardenet back then. And it was in citrus. And I said, man, I'm going to something that I have to worry about every little bit with the vegetables to go into citrus. So that, that's a perennial crop. That lasts forever. This is bound to be easier. So, so I joined them, and so I've kind of evolved through 30 years of being with the phosphate company and, with the Gardenets and so forth. And it was really good being in a commercial company, I believe, because I've been able to go places and do things. In fact, one of the first things that we did when I was with the commercial company was in 1988. We took a trip to Israel. And this is with a young man that had only flown an airplane one time. And now, all of a sudden, I'm an international traveler, an international expert with this company. And so we fly into Israel, and we get off the plane, and I'm with my boss, he's about the same age as me, in his late 20s, early 30s. And he was blonde-headed, and he was French. So we get off the plane, and man, these people are carrying machine guns. I said, I do not believe this country I'm walking into. I've never seen people with that type of armaments at an airport. And, we're walking along, and one of these guys with machine guns comes up here and singles him out, my boss. I said, whoa. And they were asking him a bunch of questions, and still to this day, I really don't know why they singled him out. But anyway, we go through there, and that was probably one of the most transformational trips that I've ever taken, because really, I could not believe I was in the land of God, our God's chosen country, and walking among these people. And it just really changed my whole life on that, And we toured. We were looking at some of the irrigation innovations, and we toured a kibbutz, and then we toured the factory where they made this drip irrigation. And so, we really saw a lot of stuff. We ate dinner with some of the people from the thing. So it was a really, really thing. And I really, if they would have said, would you like to stay here and work, and go ahead, I would have probably said, yeah. I was very adventurous in that time. Well, that was the first trip I took with them. And then the next trip we took with them was in, 2 years later, we went and toured Brazil, the citrus in Brazil, and then we went to Spain. Then I also went to France, to the home office. But Brazil was another thing. This was just a vast country of citrus. It was also about 20 years behind the United States. It was like living, like you just stepped off 20 years ago, because I remember, we were driving around, and we were talking to some of the people, and he was talking about his wife still getting up using a wood stove and grinding the coffee. I said, whoa, this is really interesting, and so forth. And again, it was, wow, if they asked me to stay, I would have probably just stayed on right there. Well, that happened back in 1996 when I was working with the company. We had gone through, and now we were bought out by corporate phosphate companies and so forth. So in 1996, they asked me would I like to go for a 3-year tour of duty in Brazil. And, of course, Linda and I were married. We still had 2 sons, and they were there. So, yeah, we said yes. I would volunteer to go for 3 years over there. And it was really a great experience to that, because you understand how the different culture lives, and to work in that. And it's great. I think I know Audrey's gone to the kibbutz in Israel, and I'm sure that was life-changing, and a very, very life-changing difference for me, too, for Linda and I to go to Brazil. So that kind of brings us up kind of currently how I've got in there. And like I say, I've been with this company 30 years. Now it's Mosaic. And so I'm just kind of briefly going to go through a little bit of what I do, and then I want to get back into the ancient agricultural traditions and some of that, and we'll go through some of that. But the first thing that we do, let's see. Yeah. Okay. First thing is citrus groves. That was a majority of where we got into agriculture in the phosphate companies, because you say, well, we got into it because this was on pre-mined land, and we needed so many thousand acres to be able to get your mining permits and everything. So we bought large large acreage of land. Well, a lot of it had citrus groves on it. So, right now, today, we have about 5,000 acres of citrus that we work on. And we used to produce a lot of boxes. But there's one thing, and I'll get to that next. And this is typical grove. This is on reclaimed land after it's been mined that we've gone through there and planted these groves. But, when you look at being in the agriculture industry, I read a lot of magazines and so forth and of some of the other crops that are grown in the United States. And almost every crop in the United States has some source of disease or insect attacking it. So, we're really in the last days of a plague being poured out upon this earth. But the interesting thing is, when I go to visit Israel, Israel doesn't have any of these problems. Israel's agriculture economy is strong, it's growing, it's vibrant, and we're hit by plagues which is really cutting our food supply in half. The production that we have, another grove we've got, but this is what's happening to our citrus. The trees are getting unhealthy by this disease called greening. There's another one. Eventually, it comes to that where you get dieback on the branches, and you just end up with nothing, and your fruit production goes back from a healthy where we were getting 4 or 5 boxes per fruit per tree down to maybe getting 1 box per tree. And this year, again, we've got another very difficult problem. This is the smallest size oranges that we've ever had in the state of Florida. So usually an orange is roughly about a tennis ball size or a little bit less. These this year are golf ball size. So usually it takes about 200 pieces of fruit to make a box. This year, the USDA came out yesterday, it's going to take over 400 pieces to make 1 box of fruit. So that's going to be a very, very difficult. So, the next thing we were looking at was reclaimed, and we were always looking for stuff to do on reclaimed soils, because this is one of the things with mining is you don't end up always with your soils, native soils to work with. So, they like to throw in another factor. Well, do something with the reclaimed soils so that we can prove to the community and keep the sustainability of this land after mining. So we looked at commercial sod, like you find the St. Augustine sods, the very high-class sods that we looked at, and this is a sod field. So basically a sod field is just like, this happens to be 100 acres. So we have a 100-acre lawn that we take care of. And we use what they call a pivot irrigation system right there. You can see that. It's just basically starts right back over there, and it's just one long span, and it sits with the well, and it's just like rotates around. So, you can adjust the speed, you can adjust the amount of water that goes out, but basically it takes about 12 hours for that to make one revolution on the thing. And the sod has been very, very good for us. And the next picture, it shows David Crum, who works with me and myself. And, Mosaic in the corporate world now has used the philosophy, do more with less. So there's only 2 people that run this agriculture, David and myself. And so we've got this. And then of course, this year they threw something else on top of us, is that they ended up buying, that's just the cut of a picture of the cuts of the sod. And the interesting thing, what I wanted to show in this one is we leave, you leave this ribbon of there, which is about 6 inches. So you only cut about 85% of your field. But when you leave that ribbon, in 1 year, that ribbon will grows back in between those two, and so you'll be able to cut this field again. So some of these fields we've cut 3 or 4 times. So it's very sustaining type of agriculture. The one thing that they've added this year to us has been the blueberries. We've had some blueberries in very, very late in the 80s, but now this was a 90-acre field over where I work near Wachulas, where our office is. So, and then we've got another 30-acre field over in Lithia near there. So we're all of a sudden we're in the blueberry business. So So that's quite interesting. And again, blueberries are a very temperamental crop. They're related to azaleas. So if anybody's got azaleas in your yard, you'll know how temperamental they can be with water, drop leaves, don't drop leaves, die back, and so forth. So that's been a real challenge. And I'm the one that does the blueberries. So I'm getting a PhD in blueberry production. now the interesting thing about this field, that 90-acre field, it's only going to be there for 2 years. It's being planned to be mined. So that's one thing else. We don't have anything permanent, and I think that's another thing when you look at the people or look on the stuff that we learn about these people, our patriarchs and matriarchs, is that there was nothing permanent. Don't get attached to something. I've learned that very close on this agriculture. Don't get attached to these groves or to your blueberries because they may not be there in 2 years. The next thing was looking for the alternative crops. Again, we're looking for crops, that'll make money. We're always looking for that money tree like everybody that's grown anything. But one of the things that we've looked at, and we have these areas, what they call clay settling areas, where through the process you end up where they separate the phosphate pebbles from the clays and the sands. Well, they put this clays in a big holding pond, and they consolidate after about 20, 25 years, and it's totally different type soil. So one of the things we were looking at trying what we could do. And these are eucalyptus trees. We've got eucalyptus mulch. That is probably one of the hottest selling items is a eucalyptus mulch right now. And one of the ones that really is preferred in the market is the red dyed mulch. And you know why? And the red dye mulches doesn't really have anything to do. That's just one of the most popular colors that people want. Well, it just so happens that the eucalyptus bark takes the dye better than any other type of tree or, cypress mulch or any other type of tree that they could use. So this becomes the most popular source because it takes the thing. And there's all kinds of theories. Well, it's eucalyptus. It keeps the insects away, the oils, and so forth. Well, there's different kinds of eucalyptus species. This species is not the one that's the aromatic or the fragrant type that you get. This one, doesn't have much smell. And I've never seen a cola bear out there yet. But this, again, this is kind of a side picture looking at it. But it's got a lot of potential. And the interesting thing with these they're probably one of the fastest growing trees in the world. They'll get up to about 50 feet in about 4.5 years. So we have figured that. And the other interesting thing is you can cut them down and then they'll grow back from the roots. So every 4 years you can cut. They'll be about a 6-inch diameter. So you're looking at cutting these things 4 times during their lifetime. One of the other interesting things this year that we're going to be doing, we've done in the past, but they didn't think we had enough stuff to do, our managers. So they said, we want you to grow 75 acres of watermelons. So we're in the process of getting the land prepared. This is a crop that we've done in the past. It's put on plastic. We're using drip irrigation, so it becomes a very intensive type of cultivation. Again, you can just see the melons out there. Actually, I don't see them in there, but they are there under the, trust me. And the other thing that we've grown on the clay settling areas, we've done some farming. We've grown mustard and some of those. And again, we're going to be working at some of those. One of the other interesting things is that, like with the citrus that we have, we do have our own greenhouse. So David's in charge of our greenhouse, and we grow about 30,000 little seedling trees per year. So that keeps us very busy on that. And then we've got what they call the Pongamia tree that we were looking at a lot of these energy crops and so forth, especially when ethanol prices were high, a lot of people with grants, and we've got a lot of land, so it kind of fit together. If we could find one of these things to grow a lot of energy crop, we would be able to do it. But the Pongamia is a tree native of India and grown in Australia, but it has little nuts on there. They look like lima beans, and you could kind of see them, and that's some of the flowers that they have on there. Then one of the other ones that we've grown has been the sorghum. We tried growing sorghum, but it just doesn't really do well in our area. We've never got the yields that we needed. And so, especially since I've been in our Hebrew roots, I've always looked at crops that maybe that were grown in the Bible and so forth. We looked at, and presently looking at olives. Of course, our climate is a very wet, tropical, almost a more tropical type climate, very different than what you would find in Israel, which is more of a temperate or a Mediterranean type climate. And so the problem that we're having with these olives is that we can't find a variety. You need a certain amount of chill hours, what they call, certain amount of cold weather to induce the flowering of the tree. We really haven't had that yet, and there's also a juvenility thing I'm going to talk about a little bit more where you need to overcome. But we have yet to get an olive off of it. This will be going on 4 years old this spring, so we'll have to see. We also tried pomegranates. That was another one of my great ideas that didn't work very well. And a lot of times I'm criticized, but then I always like to use the phrase from Thomas Edison, I have found 1,000 different things that will not work in the light bulb. So I'm not up to 1,000 different things that will not grow, but I'm getting close. So, and this last picture is what I want to show you. This is what I'm contending with right behind my heels all the time when trying to grow something is the drag line. The drag line wants to come up and dig, and it can take a couple hundred acres in a very short time. So that kind of gives you kind of a broad update on where exactly where I am on agriculture. But my real interest and my really message today was agriculture in ancient Israel. And you realize that, we always talk about it being the land of milk and honey. There's 21 Bible verses that talk about Israel inheriting a land of milk and honey. And then, we'll take Leviticus 20:24. Keeping with the tradition, we will read the verses out loud here. Leviticus 24, but I have said unto you, you shall inherit their land, and I will give it unto you to possess it, a land that floweth with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God, which have separated you from other people. So, land of milk and honey, does that look like land of milk and honey to you? Does that look like very good land to be able to go farm? But in reality, it has been. In reality, the people of Israel have done remarkable with this type of land on this thing. But, again, I'm trying to go back to when people first came into this land, when God just carried them out of Egypt and when they first crossed over the Jordan and came into this land. There was some other people, the Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, and all the ites were there. And so they were farming some of that land. And so, this is a little bit more over. Actually, this was taken, I think, on a tour in 2017 over around the Hebron area, outside of that area. But there were some good areas on there because people came back with the grapes. So that there had to be some good areas on farming on that. And even today, when you look at it there was a few areas of growing on those in the ancient times when they come in there. You had the Jezreel Valley in the north. And if you've ever been to Israel, that is really a tremendous thing to be on the mountain ridge and just look over into the Jezreel Valley because it's the breadbasket of Israel right now. It's just totally green, and you've got all your grains and everything out there. Then you've got the plain of the Sharon in the south, and the Transjordan Plateau over in Gilead, and then the springs around Jericho, and all those areas that you could to utilize. And, again, you need to, when you're looking at some of these things in the ancient Israel, really go back and look at the people as the, pastor says, really to understand everything. You need what were the people doing in those days? How were they living? That's how you can get a key on to what's really going on. And, their typical diet, they were on the Hallelujah diet before we even knew about it. I mean, Sherry and Dave, they were basically a vegetarian type diet. Barley and wheat was one of their big things. Grapes was used quite a bit. You not only that, you've got your raisin cakes, which we'll go into, and your other stuff. and olives. The oil was used primarily. That was one of the big items there. So, barley and wheat, grapes and olives, those were your primary crops that they were using. And for dinner, when you looked at it, they ate all kinds of vegetables. They had beans, lentils, cucumbers and onions being the most common, and bread. They used a lot of bread. And then, again, different classes of people ate in different ways, just like today. You've got the middle income. They supplemented with the bread and vegetables, some fish, maybe some kids or lambs. Chickens were very rare, but pigeons were very plentiful. And only the very rich could afford the fatted calf on that. So, and then again, a lot of times you didn't use this meat until you had a festival, one of the religious festivals. So you saved that fat calf for something really special. It was that Thanksgiving turkey that you're looking for. You're saving that for your special holiday coming up. And they strongly seasoned their food. But pepper was very, very expensive. So they used some alternate types of condiments. They used mustards, they used capers, cumin, saffron, corianders, mint, dill, and rosemary. And so we've heard about the coriander before. Where did you hear about that? It was back when the manna was raining down. It tasted very much like coriander. So these people were very familiar with that type of thing. And then, of course, your local wines, they were used on that. And so, now we know what their diet was. So we know kind of what kind of crops they used and so forth when they came across the Jordan. But where did they really start farming at? You come into this land, and if you remember right, the Lord said to these people, I'm not going to give you all the land right off the bat. Because if I give you all this land, you're going to have too few people. You're going to have wild beasts come back in. So, he only gave them a portion of the land. And again, maybe this was a test. He didn't give them the best land when they walked into the door. He didn't give them the fertile valleys and everything. What he gave them was in Joshua 17:16. And the children of Joseph said, Ephraim, the hill is not enough for us, and all the Canaanites that dwell in the land of the valley have chariots of iron, both they who are of Bethshean and her towns, and they who are the valley of Jezreel. So, automatically, they were not given those things. There's people down there that's got chariots and spears and stuff. We can't take them right now. So, he gave them the hill country. So, what was characteristic of the hills countries back then? Here you've got small land holdings. You don't have a lot of room on those hills. You can't give a large acreage at one time. It's a tense work. You've got to cut out this hillside to kind of make terraces. I'll show you a picture next of the terraces. And it requires experience and know-how to yield survival in this. And the one thing I want to stress on this stuff, this is substance farming. If you don't make a crop, you don't eat. You don't have a lot of stuff that's stored up. So, it's not going down to Publix. There wasn't a Publix right down the road to go get something if your grapes didn't make the crop or that. If you literally, if you would go, you could die if you did not have a crop that year. And, there were some basic tools that these people had. Basically, you didn't have any of the tractors or any of the modern things. You had a hoe. You basically had a sturdy hoe, and then if you were really lucky, you had what they were called a mattock, which was just a bigger, heavy, kind of like a grubbing hoe that you could get those rocks out. And then, eventually you got a crude plow, which they called an ard, which was just like a wooden thing, and if you're lucky, it may have some metals, but you kind of plowed some of the furrows with that. But again, this land was very rocky. You had to spend hours of getting these rocks out of your way even to be able to do that. Now, this next slide will kind of show you exactly what you had to do with that. You can notice how these terraces of olive trees. So, you don't have a lot of land between the areas, arable land. Now, you could plant olives or you could plant some other stuff. And this was particular back in 2017 that they were harvesting these olives, and basically they were still doing it probably the way they did in the biblical times, is you put a cloth down there and shake those things and gather them up. So, and I think that's one of the things you'll see. You'll see some very ancient ways in Israel of farming that's done typically the way it was done, in biblical time, and you're going to see some very modern, even more modern than what we have in the United States. So you've got those contrasts in there, but again, it's just remarkable what Israel's been able to do. And again, while I'm on this thing right here, was the one thing that I do want to mention on that. This week's Torah portion, it was talking about the wells, and as these farmers started doing the hill country, sometimes some of them became very ingenious on being able to have some irrigation water. They would cut holes in the rocks with cisterns, and as rainwater would go, they would collect, and they through a series of channels and stuff, they would be able to release this water and be able to irrigate some of their crops. However, you would have raid parties, and you would have the Bedouins was one of the raiding parties back in the early biblical time. They would come and they would clog up the channels and the water and so forth, and try to starve these people out. Basically, you're trying to have, if you have a failure, you're out of there. So this idea, the concept of clogging wells up with sand or doing the other stuff, that was definitely not due, back then. It's going on as these people come along there. And this particular problem was also on some of the first kibbutz when they were trying to do that. These raiding parties would come in. So even up into the 40s and 50s, they were reverting back to the ways of the biblical time of trying to destroy the wells and water source. And because that kind of brings us into the next thing that I wanted to talk about on that is there's really, this is my botany. I spent 4 years to learn this concept, that the plant needs 4 basic elements to survive. I learned one a year when I was at USF. Water, light, oxygen or air, and nutrients. Without any one of those, at some point, your plant's going to die. And really, the one that I want to talk about, Israel has lots of light. Everybody's got the same atmosphere, basically all over the world that we live in. And nutrients, you can supply them. Some of them are more, some soils have more nutrients, natural nutrients than others. But those are one of the things that you kind of manipulate a little bit in the art of farming. But really, the most intense is water. Water is life. Even our own bodies, if we can go many more days without food, but if we don't have water, we're not going to survive. And it's the same with the plant. In Leviticus 26:19, and I will break the pride of your power, and I will make your heavens as iron, and your earth as brass. So, and again, this next picture, this was in Iowa. Not all of the United States crops are irrigated, and this is what it looks like if you don't get rain versus the bottom picture when you get rain. And again, if this happened while you were in biblical times without that water, your whole existence is at stake right there. You could be, as God could use this to send the people, just as He sent the people to Egypt, and the people, come down because of the famines. Well, the famine could have been because they didn't have rain. It could have very well been the reason why Joseph and his family had to go to Egypt. So that, the water is a powerful motivator. And again, look in modern day Israel. There, you can look right up there. You see this area right here? It's got irrigation. Somewhere there's a natural spring or something that they've been able to store water. And you look around here, not a lot of green going on around there. So irrigation makes a tremendous difference in being able to live. So, as I said, they didn't have a lot of irrigation. You just didn't call up your irrigation company or your utility company and say, send me some water over there in the biblical days. But as we'll say, Leviticus 26:4. Then I will give you rain in the due season, and the land shall yield her increase, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit. So God is our supplier. Even today, God supplies our needs. And again, sometimes, just like with Rachel and not Rachel, but Rebecca, we try to do what we want to do to get the outcome that we want. You know, God is in charge of rain. Instead of really maybe praying for it and working on that, we'll go manipulate. No rain, we'll flip on the irrigation switch. You know, that's what we'll do. And I'm not saying that, you know, it's totally that's God's given us the ability to be able to do that. But I think sometimes we get caught up in saying, I'm the master of the total situation. Well, we're really not the masters. I mean, even when we farm today or at my job, you know, it's very easy. It's David and I said, man, we did a good job, didn't we, Dave? We pulled that baby through. Well, it really wasn't our problem. You know, it was God's that really do it. So sometimes we just have to say, yeah, Dave, God did a great job on that, even though you might have helped him a little bit. So I think, you know, we've got to keep God at the foremost in all that we do. And then, you know, another verse that we have on that is in Joel. Be glad then, ye children of Zion, and rejoice in the Lord your God, for he hath given you the former rain moderately, and he will cause to come down for the rain, the former rains and the latter rains in the first month. Okay, we're going to get into the former rains and the latter rains, and I always kind of get confused a little bit on that, but hopefully we will be able to go through there. The next slide would be, you know, when you really look back in the Hebrew, the former rains with Yorah comes from the same root, shoot, cast, teach, like an arrow being shot at the target, information being directly delivered from teacher to pupil. The Yorah rains are sent down to soften up the ground, ready for the first round of planting. So these rains, you know, are typical. You've got two different seasons of rains. You know, you've got your early rains, and these, you know, the Yorah rains, which are soften the rains. Now, these particular rains come not in a torrent like you see in some of our thunderstorms that we have in here, but they come as a nice, gentle rains. And you know, you'll remember some of the times when we have cold fronts come through in December and January, how you just get a rain that rains all day long, and it's a very gentle rain, and the whole ground gets saturated. It's not really where everything runs off. So this was a type of that rain. And then, you know, the latter rains are the makash, are much harder rains that would have just caused flooding and devastation if they had come earlier on the dry, dusty ground. Because you've got to remember, you've got this dry ground, this dusty type ground. It's got a little bit of clay in it, unlike our sand. But, you know, when you have that clay in there, when you get a heavy rain, it just washes off and doesn't go in. It doesn't really wet the ground. So, you know, the former or early rains start in the fall. And actually, we're almost right now in the season of the early rains in Israel. They start mid-September to mid-November, and the latter rains, start mid-March to mid-April. And I think this is important because, you know, this kind of goes along with the calendar we'll get into. So if you kind of remember those dates, if you got something you want to take those down. And also, I tried to take this chart. I'm not going to be able to see it very well. This was the Jerusalem climate data from last year. But I put in here's the later rains. This is March and April right in here. There's where your later rains come in there. And again, you know, you've got to take a little bit of looking at here. They've had a little bit of January, February, but there's the latter rain starts right in there. And you notice, though, they do really taper off when you get into May, June. You go all through that hot summer. And then here we got September through November. You start seeing how these rains have started picking up. And so I'm sure over the years this has shifted a little bit, the climatology a little bit, but I think the trend is still there. And one of the things I kind of tied this together with, you look at the festivals or the feast days. You know, you got the Pesach right here in the spring. You got unleavened bread, and then you know you back over here. You've got Shavuot, and then of course we've got the tabernacles right over here where you've got these rains coming in here. And another typical thing, if you think about Florida's climate, we get about 50 inches of rain a year is our typical. And also, when I lived in Brazil, that was typical of the area where I lived on the agriculture area there. They got about 50 inches of rain per year. But look, if you added all these numbers up, they're only got, that's 4, there's 6, that's almost 7. You've got maybe 10. You're getting about half of that, 17 or 18 inches of rain. So you've got a very, very different climate that you're working with, where you're looking at that and you're showing that water is a critical factor in there. And I think I'm going to go ahead and bring up now. I had talked about this a little bit later that I was going to bring this out, but we talk about these feast days on this thing, and we just finished Sukkot Tabernacles here, the ingathering here, and but while we're talking about water, I'm going to talk about water right now on this. That the water libation ceremony on the 8th great day, this was crucial. This was really a crucial thing, because if you didn't get this rain starting right there, your ground's going to be, you're really hurting. And so these people really did it. And this was probably one of the most joyous ceremonies of the whole Sukkot thing. This was just, everybody was singing. All the Levites, and the priests, they were playing instruments, singing. And this went on for a whole day. I mean, it started early in the morning. And then basically they had like the floodlights that the people put on it. But they had these big 4 poles. And then they have the priest in learning would climb these poles with jugs of oil on them and put them way up there. So you're thinking of these big floodlights. And that was going to light the whole stage up for the whole night. This was an all-night ceremony. So they put those up, the poles, and the whole night they were celebrating. At dawn, they went to the spring of the Shiloh at the foot of the walls of Jerusalem. They used a special golden urn, and the priests, Levites, brought that back up to the thing, and they poured it in a special offering in the thing. But I mean, this just goes to show you how important this water libation thing is, and that brings me to the thing in John 7:37. I don't have that up here, but it was in the last days, that great day of the feast. Jesus stood and cried, saying, "If any man thirst, let him come unto me and drink. He that believeth on me, as the Scripture says, out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water." And I think this is just an example of how Yeshua used some of these traditions of the feast and some of the traditions of agriculture in portraying the spiritual aspects of his ministry. So that's one of the reasons why I think this is so important to understand this. And speaking of water, I'm going to get a drink of water right here. The next thing we're going to come to is it's what I like to call the old folks calendar. And it's a geezer calendar. That's for those over 65. But no, that's not really why it's called the geezer calendar. But the geezer calendar holds a lot of our knowledge of what we know about the agriculture today, because it was founded by an archaeologist, Stuart McAllister, in the ancient Canaan city of Gezer, which is 20 miles west of Jerusalem. So this is probably one of the most significant finds that really kind of explains what we understand about how they lived in those days. The Gezer calendar. That's what it looked like. It was just a small little tablet with the actually written in Hebrew on the thing there. And when it comes down here, the translation of it, and they thought, there's many speculations on this, this probably could be considered one of the first farmer's almanacs ever made. And number 2, it could be a school's primer for the youngsters. So, but what would be more important than to learn when's the proper time to be doing these things to pass on your traditions? So, basically it starts out 2 months gathering, September, October, in the Hebrew calendar, Tishri and Shesvan. 2 months of planting, November to December, Kislev and Tevet. 2 months of late sowing, January, February, and Shot at Adar. Next slide. 1 month of cutting flax, March and Nisan. 1 month reaping barley, April, Iyar. 1 month of reaping and measuring grains, May and Sivan. And 2 months of pruning, June and July, Tammuz and Av. 1 month summer fruit, August, Elul. And those are the ones that we go through there now, and the pastors, expounded really a lot on, the summer months and what goes on and during that time and the pruning. But I wanted to go back now, and that's what the actual sayings were on that calendar. But I want to go back, and we're going to look at each one of those a little bit more in depth. The first one was the 2 months of gathering, September through October. Olives is one of the last crops to be harvested in Israel. Typically, it goes from mid-September to mid-November, And then, you've got that time period. This is when the rain season also starts coming in. And then you've got you're ending up with the feast days. You've got the tabernacle feast, the ingathering. And so you've got all three of these things happening at the right time. So basically, you've got the olives as the very end of the crop. So once you've got the olives kind of gathered up and everything, you're ready for Sukkot. And so, being like in any type of farming thing, once you finish the crop, everybody celebrate. I mean, even today, when we finish our citrus crops, our watermelons crops, it's like, wow. It really feels great. And sometimes I try to talk our boss into taking us fishing or doing something, and usually we do. But it is a great feeling. So, you're ready to celebrate. It's just inbred into you that you want to celebrate when you have finished all your labor and you see what you've done. Number 2, 2 months of planting grain in November through January. And this one, Miss Libby does a great job when we're over on the feast of counting the omers and so forth. But barley and wheat are planted. And, when we first got here, we started planting the barley and the wheat, which was with Libby in there, and it was great to watch this come up there. So we had a really good time till the squirrels ate it. Now we know squirrels love it too. So, but and then you've got your also you got 2 months in the latter part of that, your late planting, including crops. The other crops that we talked about. You've got your garlic, your cucumbers, melons, the lentils, chickpeas, sesame, millet, and other vegetables. Because you know what? The people of Israel they loved the melons and cucumbers, because remember, that's right in the middle of the desert. We had those back in Egypt, man. I'm ready to go back. So, of course, they would be planting this when they got those in the new land, because that was just part of their diet, one of their favorite foods on the thing. And let's see. I had a little bit of a couple notes. Let me see if I can find those on the wheat. Basically, there's a couple different kinds of wheat, and one of the differences on the wheat, because the wheat in the time, especially when you planted the barley, because the barley really symbolized when your next festival was going to be coming along, because that was when your first fruits was coming. Then when you took your sheaves and made your first offering on first fruits was really the first thing of barley. So basically, it was one of those types of crops where that when you planted it, and that was how they timed it. So the barley they had in those days and the wheats were a little bit different, because we've got a little bit different timing on that. But that was one of the keys that triggered when the next festival was coming. And well, this was kind of 2 months of late planting. As I said, you got the garlics and everything, chickpeas and everything on that. And then number 4, you had the harvesting of flax. It was in March. You had the late rain start coming in there. And the flax is kind of an interesting crop. Cotton, for cotton fabrics was made out of cotton. Well, back then, linen was the in fashion design back then for your fabric was everything was made out of linen. So flax was what was used to do with linen. And harvesting the flax, you cut it, but it was a little bit different because you had to soak that in water after you harvested those stalks. And that's basically the picture on your right is what it looks like right when it's flowering. But you would cut those stalks just like you would wheat with a sickle, but you would soak those in water until they were almost rotten. So I can just imagine the mess that you're looking at. And then they would come in there and they would take like a big comb, and they would pull those fibers. It was very fibrous, the stalks. So you start pulling those out, and that's how you came up with the thread. There's some various other processes they went through, but it was a very tedious type of operation. And then we've got the harvesting of the barley. It's April. This was the feast day. You got Passover, unleavened breads, and first fruits. So right in there was when you started the first thing of the harvesting. And you notice the barley, how you told the barleys from the barley versus the wheat. The barley always bowed down, and of course that's barley was always represented by the Jewish people, as Libby would say that they're bowing to the Lord, and so she does a great teaching. So if those have never been able to hear it during the time of the Omers will be great. And I did go into a lot of the threshing and so forth because she does such a great job on that. Of course, and then we come to the harvest of the wheat crop. First day, the Feast of Weeks, Pentecost. There we go. We've got the harvesting of the wheat. So you see how all those spring feasts kind of fall right into the agricultural calendar on that. And again, remember I told you how the barley bowed down, and you can see this doesn't bow down as well on the wheat. It wants to stand direct. So those are Ephraim or the Gentiles. we're just not nonconformists there, nonconformists. And now here comes the dangerous times. The dangerous times in that it's a vine tending. That's mid-June. This is where your things are getting kind of slow. You're tending fruit trees, olives, grapes during the heat of the summer. And I think that's where the Aaron built the golden calf. We got into all those kind of problems, and that's where the pastor's always warning us: be careful during the summer months. So that's when weeds can overtake your vineyards. That's when you just get slouchy and just don't keep looking at stuff. But then, once you get back out of that, you go back into your fruit harvesting again. It keeps you busy, keeps your mind on what you need to be doing. You're going back into the grapes, figs, pomegranates. So those, that kind of went back over there. Now, there's one thing that I wanted to kind of bring up because this is probably one of the most famous Bible verses, but one of the well-known ones is the wheat and tares in Matthew 12, 27 through 30. So the servants of the household came and said unto him, Sir, didst not thou sow good seed in thy field? From whence then hath the tares? He said unto them, An enemy has done this. The servant said unto him, Will then now we go and gather them up? But he said, Nay, let them rest while you gather up the tares. You root up also the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest and into the time of harvest. I will say unto the reapers, Gather them together, first the tares, bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. Now, we'll see how good you people are that you can, because you really, as Pastor says, you can't see the wheats from the tares in the congregation. But we'll see how good you guys are. Which one's the wheat and which one's the tares? So, they both look very similar, don't they? Well, if you guess the one on the right, that is the tares. So, they look very similar to the wheat, but they're really, when you really look down there, they're not as prolific. They don't have as many seeds. Perhaps you can see the people by their works, they say. the tares don't have as much works on their thing. You don't have as many seeds. So, maybe that is one reason. Now, there's some other interesting things on here because, Yeshua said, don't go out there because you're going to pull up the other ones. Well, when you read it, when you look at it without the seed head on there, the only way you can really tell the tares, it has a little wider leaf blade. So, the possibility of really being able to distinguish it it's very difficult until they get older. But then, the other problem is you really want to get those before they start seeding out or producing the seeds because, the tares, it's toxic. They're, even one seed will give you a stupor. I mean, you can get dizzy, and it gives you almost like a drug-like effect on that. So you certainly didn't want to get one. And it said just a couple seeds in the barley when you were making the bread. It would give you a stupor-type state. So you didn't want to do that. So you want to do that. So now you see the importance of separating the wheat from the tares. And the next section I'm going on to, which is one of the biggest sections that I want to do, and we talk a lot about, is the vines, the vineyards. That is probably one of the largest areas covered in there, and I know a lot of people have gone down with Hayavel and worked in the vineyard, so I thought that would be a really interesting topic to look at on that. So, construction of vineyard. There are a couple of verses about that. Matthew 21:33. Here another parable. There was a certain household which planted a vineyard, hedged around about it, digged a winepress in it, built a tower, and let it out to husbandmen, and went into a far country. Now, the reason I use this one is, actually, this particular verse lists just about every item in there of how a vineyard is constructed. When you really start going back through that verse, you've got, he plants a vineyard, he hedged it around about. Well, we'll go into that, look at that. Basically, he built a hedge around it with rocks. He dug a wine press in it. You got to have a wine press if you're going to have a vineyard. He built a tower. Most every vineyard had a tower lookout area in it. And this was kind of an optional. If you were very wealthy, then a lot of times you would just contract it out, and that would be our husbandry on the thing. And, the next verse I've got here, Isaiah 5:1-2. I will sing to my well-beloved a song of my beloved touching his vineyard. My well-beloved hath a vineyard in a very fruitful hill. There's another clue. Most of the time, the vineyards are in a hill in those days. So there are all kinds of clues in the Bible. You just got to be able to go through there and read it. And I think that's one of the nicest things. And that's one thing I don't know how I left that out, but Linda and I have read through the Bible like 3 or 4 times. So I mean, I think it's very critical in our walk that we be able to read through the Bible and have a plan to read through the Bible each day on the thing, and not only do the Torah portion, but to read on there, because each time we read through it, we gain more insights. And even putting this together, I really didn't put all these verses together, that they're actually giving you clues of what this ancient vineyard really looked like. Now, there's continued with this one. And he fenced it, gathered out the stones, therefore planted it with the choicest vines, built a tower in the midst of it, also made a winepress therein, and he looked that it should bring forth grapes, and it brought forth wild grapes. So something happened along the way. It didn't produce the way he thought it was going to be. And this next verse, Proverbs. I went by the field of the slothful and the vineyard of the man void of understanding. And lo, it was all grown over with thorns and nettles, had covered the fence thereof, the stone wall thereof was broken down. Then I saw and considered it well. I looked upon it and received instructions. Yet a little sleep, a little slumber, so shall the poverty come as one that traveled, and thy want as an armed man. Now, I like that. I love that verse. I'm always telling that to David. But anyway, we sit around and do nothing, and poverty's going to overtake us. And I think that's one of the things that that the pastor talks about on the summer months when the vines. Look what happens. He wasn't keeping his mind on the job. He wasn't keeping his mind on the Bible. He wasn't doing the things of God. He wasn't doing the spiritual exercises. And what happened? The vines came up, took over the vineyard. So don't let that happen. So we've read all these verses now. Now, in this next slide, I just kind of outlined exactly what they said in a kind of a bullet point. The vineyards were often located on a hillside. Now, that doesn't necessarily need to be this and nowadays, but I mean, in those days, that was your choicest land. The grapevines like sandy, loose soil. So the only way you're going to get some of that soil is you're going to have to dig those rocks out and plow it up a little bit. And you need plenty of sunshine. And again, this is one of the reasons why and air, when I say air by day, basically they're talking about air drainage where the leaves will dry out. You don't get a lot of moisture condensation for different funguses and so forth. So you've got to have good airflow. Well, you get good airflow when you're on the side of a hill. Everything flows down to the bottom of the hill. All your rain, your moisture and everything. And then generally they have a wall with a ditch built around them. And, I've often seen in the Bible, well, you see these walls and everything. But I really didn't realize that when not only did they build this wall, but basically what they did when you had a vineyard, you went through there and you dug a ditch on the outside of your property line. Now, you took that soil that you dug the ditch, which I'm not really sure the footage, but probably 2 or 3 feet, and you took that soil and put it on top of your property line, and then from that property line is where you put other additional stones up there to make the wall a little bit higher. So this was really kind of a twofold purpose because, you had wild animals and so forth coming in there. So not only do they have to jump a wall, but they've got a ditch before you can get up to the wall, and that also deter any type of robbers or any other type of people that want to do you harm to come in that. So the next item was you had to remove the large stones from the field. And, looking back on some of those pictures of Israel, there is plenty of stones in the field in Israel. But it makes a good fence. You got plenty of natural materials there. Then you took the soil and you prepared it by hoeing and spading. So you took those heavy-duty hoes, those adars, you just kept chopping it up till you kind of got all the stones out of there, and you just kind of got a nice little mixture. Then you planted the vines, Now, you got to plant the right vines. You don't want wild vines. You've got to have a vine that is going to produce the kind of grapes and the quality that you want. And then the next thing that you would do after you got the vines all built, you're going to build a watchtower. Now, the watchtower serves a couple different purposes, but again, the watchtower is to look over and see who's over the field, wild animals and everything. And I found that really kind of particularly interesting when I talked about that because in Brazil, we had watchtowers in the groves. It'd kill you walking up those things, but they were made with telephone poles, and they were like tree houses. And you'd walk up 35, 40 feet of steps, and you'd be 35, 40 feet in the air to look out over these groves. We had several thousand acres, and you look after them. I never really figured it out, but now I know they must have had the same kind of marauders there. The Bedouins were there, so it's strange how some of those customs continued on. You just don't see them now. Nowadays, we just send a drone up. That's how I took that aerial picture there with the thing. We didn't have a watchtower out in the blueberries, but let's see. Okay. Oh, and another thing was interesting that I found on studying this is that excuse me, a lot of these, the nutrition and so forth, they weren't really that much in nutrition of knowing exactly how to fertilize or care for this. But I think God took care of this because a lot of this soil, a lot of those rocks were a limestone type of rock, which as it rained and so forth would melt down. And some of the lime kind of helped different for the soil reactions and the soil pH. And kind of interesting that this lime helped that. And then I remember reading in American history, even Benjamin Franklin had used some experiment. He was one of the first that did an experiment what they called land plaster, which is just lime, and how he wrote up and everything that it improved his crops. I said, man, Benji, baby, you're late. They already did this in Israel way long time ago. So I thought that was kind of an interesting sidestep. Now there's what a watchtower, even in modern kind of times. That's what your watchtower looked like. You know, you can see here, you got your fence kind of here. This is like a terrace, but this is probably not, well, this probably is grapevines now that I think of it. Look, there's a small area, but you've got your fence and around there, and then you've got a watchtower. So that, that was pretty common. Now, this next picture is one of really, of more of an ancient times there. And the interesting thing is that you see up there, they would also always generally put a little shelter over the top of it to keep the sun and everything where you wouldn't be broiling in the hot sun. But another interesting fact, and usually attached along the edge of there, was another little outbuilding like. And that's where the people would live during the summer months when they were doing this, because it may have been cooler being on the hillside and so forth, but they did live mostly during the summer pruning, and maybe that kept them out of trouble during the summer on that, of doing anything. But that's where they stayed during the vineyards. During that would be staying out there during those times. And this is another particularly interesting type of agriculture, because when I was in Brazil, most people don't live on the farms. The only people that lived on farms in Brazil were people, the workers. If you were a landowner and you had like a 15-acre farm, you lived in the city. Everybody lived in the city, and then they would just commute to go to their farm. So again, maybe this is a very typical situation where you didn't necessarily live on your farm. You may have lived a short distance from there, but then during the summer, and most of these houses, people had a house in there where the owner could go away on the weekend. They called them weekend retreats there, but he did have a residence there where he could go and spend time living on the farm. But he didn't live there full time. And then there's really some of the ancient vineyards. That is real. That's some of the real old types. And again, it's really hard to say what the spacings were and so forth in those days. But obviously, they did it where they thought it was being very productive for them, and did well. Next one, we're going to go into the fruit production. You've got your vines and everything in there, so that everything's going along. You've got your next vineyard going in here. And we'll read Leviticus 19:23 through 24:5. And when you shall come into the land, you shall have planted all manner of trees for food. Then you shall count the fruit thereof as uncircumcised. 3 years shall it be as an uncircumcised unto you. It shall not be eaten of. But in the 4th year, all the fruit thereof shall be holy, to praise the Lord withal. And in the 5th year, you shall eat the fruit therefore, that it may yield unto you the increase. Therefore, I am the Lord your God. So, the reason I put that verse in there is really interesting, because God is more or less programmed into fruit trees and some of these trees that you're not going to eat. It takes 3 or 4 years for the maturity, especially some of your older fruit trees. When we grow citrus, the citrus typically will not bear a good crop until the 4th year. Now, you might get a small crop on the 2nd and 3rd year, but basically you should take the fruit off, because it's not going to be very good. It's not very mature tasting. And it drags the tree down. Now, why would you leave? Why does it need 4 years for you to get your to not have fruit on your tree? For number one, you need to grow a strong tree. You can't have a tree that's bearing fruit and being dragged down by having that fruit on there. All your nutrients are going into the production of the fruit. But God wants you to build a strong tree. He wants you to build a strong body. He wants you to be spiritual. You need to be strong. You can't be You can't be a newborn Christian and trying to go out and minister to somebody until you know and strengthen yourself up in the spirituality of the stuff. So it's the same thing with the fruit tree. And fortunately, God has pretty much inbred that into a lot of the trees where they won't produce until they're older. And like I said with the olives, typically a lot of these trees won't do well until they're, mature, which we call, after 4 years. But man always likes to interfere, We always like to interfere, So, well, we got citrus there. So, how much more money could we make if we could get that to fruit in 2 years or 3 years and not wait those extra years? So we put all this fertilizer, everything else on there and do it. Well, God took it back with greening. He just took all that away. So we're back to nothing. So, those are some of the things that you got to consider when you're doing those is what God does it. Now, we're going into the next one. Fruit production, especially on grapes. Grapes develop on new growth which sprouts from 1-year-old wood. So basically what it's saying is you won't get a production of a grape unless the vine or that wood that it's on there is at least 1 year old. And this is after, of course, the tree's up to 4 years old. So each year you've got to have a 1-year-old branch to do that. Now, if it's a 2-year-old branch, the old branches, nope, not going to produce fruit. Or if it does, it's going to be a very bad quality and it's not going to be good. So year one, you prune away all your sprouts. And this is coming into some of the pruning techniques. In year one, prune away all sprouts coming up from the ground except the strongest one. From that one, you let the main canes, which each branch is called a cane, and you let that develop. And then you can have, it could be almost like a menorah where it comes up where you got 5 or 7 branches coming. Depends on how you want to train it. There's a lot of different ways. And that probably producing grapes is probably the most unscientific, and it's more of an art than any other crop I've looked at. There's always an art to it. Year 2, you train these, the main canes in 2 levels along a trellis fence. And most everything is trellis. I'll show you some pictures in Israel. And in the second fall, you prune off about 70% of the plant, just leaving the main trunk. And then the canes will be a year old in the spring, which means they can sprout the necessary growth to develop the vines after you go through these different years of pruning. Let's see where my... Now, talking about again for the fruit, there's a couple things that I guess we'll go ahead and get into this next slide here. There's pruning. What I'm talking about on John 15:1-2, I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman. Every branch in me that beareth not fruit, he taketh away. Every branch that beareth fruit, he purgeth it, that may bring forth more fruit. So there you go. There's this whole vine goes back to the viticulturist that would know what Jesus is talking about, because we just went through this. You've got your different fruiting only occurs on branches that are over 1 year old. So if you've got some really old branches, you need to pull them off because they're not going to produce any fruit on those. And what little fruit you do, you're wasting all this energy, which you could produce that 100-fold crop that Yeshua talks about instead of did it tenfold. So that's not good for the tithing sermon on that. So, and this is what I'm talking. You're moving previous year's fruiting canes or spurs. You're maintaining the integrity of the trellis or the tree, and you're maximizing the production of grapes. So this is what it's coming down. You want that 100-fold increase in your production. And without doing the pruning, you're not going to be the strong Christian. Without taking out some of those things, you're not going to be the strong Christian that God wants you to be. So the same thing with the vine. You're not going to produce your maximum yield for your grapes. And there you go. There's your vineyard. That kind of takes everything. That's a modern day. That's coming right out of I believe, oh, that's Joshua's altar, coming out of Joshua's altar, coming right down out of their area there. Small vineyard. You got that slope coming down there. Again, here's another picture. This is Havel right there before we went and start harvesting. Man, and again, we're talking about the Lord blessing Israel. That when we were there in 2017, they had the best crop ever. And you know what? After a year ago, I read an article, or last year, for Italy, the strongest, one of the wine areas there, their vines are dying. They've got a disease that is killing 400-year-old vines. Yet in Israel, the industry is striving. So, God is blessing Israel, certainly. Again, I said, most of them on hills. Well, they don't have to be on a hill nowadays. You can have them on a straight line. And this is actually in the desert south of, just about near Beersheba, right around Beersheba where they were growing these. Again, you can see how they start off. They've got these little trellises going up there. They've got a little thing around here that keeps. Basically, what this does is keep any sprouts or anything from making too many branches, and you get a really nice main trunk. And this is one of the areas of the four things why plant. This allows no light in that area, so you get no sprouting of any additional branches in it. Again, this was probably one of the most radical, and I'm not really sure where I took this picture, but that's just a form of trellising. That's why I say this is very much an art, where they're having the vines grow out of here. The only problem with that, you're going to have a very small tractor to go underneath that. You don't want to, or maybe you just walk through it. I don't know, but that a lot of stuff is set up nowadays where you can get mechanization through it and that forth. That's why some of the stuff is done that way. Now, the one thing that I want to talk about is the last thing on this is, we talked about the vineyard, how we grew it and everything. Well, we've got great production. What are we going to do with it? We've got to have the press to produce this into juice. And basically, this is a treading floor. You just got a big stone area right here. You've got like a second little hole in here where you do the secondary crushing. And, you see right on the edge of here, you've got like a pole here. Well, you could either put that pole in there to make kind of a shade over there, or I've seen some of these pictures where you put a pole in there with some ropes hanging down so people wouldn't fall in there. And one of the interesting things was why people went barefooted in those was that you didn't want to crush the seeds, because if you crush the seeds with your shoes or sandals, it makes the wine more bitter. So you want to keep away from that. Now this next slide shows you a little bit more. It'll be hard, but basically, here's your main threshing floor right here. And usually they had where your filter could go down there, and you had this little filter where you could kind of hold off some of the stuff, and you allowed it. You could stop it off, and of course you needed this stuff to ferment a little bit. So this was your primary fermenting vat that you had right there on the that, and then you could open up, filter out some of the stuff, and next went down into the pool where you could, as it went on there, you could go on in there and bottle it off, and you kept the bottles or the jugs by the cool place. And so it was kind of a fairly interesting and kind of a 2 or 3 step process on this stuff. But if you had a vineyard of any size, you needed to have one of these. And mostly, again, these were honed out of rock. This particular picture there shows mosaic, so they kind of tiled it over or stuff like this. This is probably a really high-class vintage. That was the $10 a bottle wine that they were making there. And one of the places where you got was this, where you could hold up this stuff was what they called the dibs, And the dibs was a very thick as molasses. And basically it was like a jam. It was just the pulp and everything, and it just kind of made it into the dibs. And this is probably what Jacob sent to Joseph in Egypt, was what they call these dibs. And basically it said it takes 300 pounds of grapes to make 100 pounds of dibs. So it was just the peel and everything, and it just kind of fermented a little bit, and you made dibs. So I'll take dibs on that. And the other thing, that you could make on this was raisins. During September and October's when they, zero. So, well, we're going to just go a little bit more of that. So the raisins is one thing that made the September and October, and that's the fresh ripe grapes are eaten along with bread. That was one of the principal foods. But, you would just sit these out, you dry them, and you dry them in there. And interesting thing I found out making that, because everybody's seen grapes that you set out in the car that got stuck underneath the seat and come out raisin. But they kept the skin moist with olive oil, which was very different, and that kept them from drying out too quickly and kept it more even. And so this was probably, I think, remember Abigail, when David came in there, she made these raisin cakes and sent to him. That's what this was. And then, of course, when David brought the tabernacle to Jerusalem, he made all these cakes that he gave out to everybody. So this was basically what they made on their thing. That's pretty much. I had a little bit more, but since I'm out of time, I forgot one thing when we were going through on my, and I think that's the very last slide too. Oh, this slide right here. This slide right here shows kind of a conceptual artist of that. And you'll see right here. There's the vat for the grapes. There's where it goes through that filtering, and you come out with the good stuff. You got your fence row there. You've got your lookout tower there. It's on the hillside. So that's a pretty good artist rendition of that. And I'll go back a little bit to about me. I forgot to put in there. Actually, Linda and I had gone to churches and everything when we got back from Brazil. We got back from Brazil in the year 2000. And, we took a long time to find a church in this area, but we ended up going to a community church, which was kind of like a Baptist doctrine church. And so, we started going to that, and we kept reading the Bible, and we kept saying, there's got to be something more than what we're doing to this, because it was a seeker-friendly church, and it seems like we were just going over the same stuff every week. And then Linda met Kathy, and Kathy this was probably 2007. So, for like a whole year, they were together in Mary Kay and so forth. And one of the meetings was on Monday night. And Kathy would always say, "No, I can't do that." Or they would have an event on a Saturday, some kind of thing. And Kathy said, "No, I can't do that. I've got to be at church." And I've told Linda, I said, "Tell her the New Testament, man. That stuff's done away with. We don't do that anymore." So, we did that, and then and it kind of, like I say, when I went to Israel, I really felt the thing. But I had started listening to Messianic music, and it really touched my heart. And I still have a big collection of Messianic music and everything and all that. And I have to go back one little point on that, because when we was in Israel, when I was in Brazil, I had the opportunity to put in irrigation, and we used irrigation. We used Netafim, the irrigation company. It was a $2 million project that we did. We did like 5,000 acres, and it was a very big project. But and I really felt good, because I said, man, I'm helping the Jewish people. This is a good irrigation system. But you'll never really know how much heartache I had from the company I was working with, because they were so anti-Semitic. Man, they would not. I had to fight tooth and nail to get them to do that project. I really did. And looking back on it now, I can see that. But and I remember about the finance guys. Those Jews, I can't stand them. They want their, it was on. Hey, they're God's people. Come on, give me a break. And I knew him really well, but he was very anti-Semitic. He didn't like driving with them either, but that was another point. But that was one point. So I always had that concept of the Jewish people being God's chosen people. And then, there was a special place on my heart. And then the music, I loved the music, and I listened to it all the time. And then one day, Kathy, invited Linda to they were doing right down to Purim. She said, they're having a Purim play. And so So Linda was going to go, and she didn't even ask me if I want to go. I said, well, can I go too? And she said, yeah, you can come with me. so we went, and then we did the play, and it was great. And Bill was in it and everything. Bill Carter, and then we had. And then Pastor Nick said next week their guest was going to be Lenny and Varna. I said, Linda, I know Lenny and Varna. We listened to music and everything. I said, we got to come back. So we never stopped coming. So that was the year 2008. So like Kathy says, you just sometimes got to keep people keep asking the people in there. And I appreciate your time. I hope y'all learned something. I mean, I learned something putting this together, and I appreciate Pastor Nick for the opportunity and for the leadership to be able to do this. Thank you.